Okay.
This is the guy on the left there. He's from Woodbury County Conservation, and this is a photo of him on a wildfire in Montana. And then that's our squad on the right on that same fire in Montana. And it's all folks from Iowa, most of them from county conservation, some from the DNR, some from the private sector. And we try to get a crew of 20 together every year and go out and work on a fire.
Do you ever have any volunteers that choose to do that?
Yep.
Okay.
Occasionally we'll have volunteer fire department personnel.
How long are you usually out when you're deployed?
When we go on assignment, the assignment can be as long as 14 days, and then we usually have a couple travel days on the front and back end. So we're usually away from home about 18 days.
Okay. 18 days.
Yeah. And this is
14 days fighting fire.
We also work with the volunteer fire departments here in the area. Occasionally they'll get calls on fires and they need assistance, and so if we're available, we'll go help them out. And this is from a fire that we helped on at the Mount Crescent ski area down by Crescent a few years ago. And Mount Crescent is adjacent to Hitchcock Nature Center, which is where we're based, and we were actually getting ready to do a prescribed fire. And we heard the pager go off, and the comm center was calling for a wildfire, and we saw the smoke and said we can respond, and we went and helped put out that fire. And occasionally the fire departments will call us, and we just, if we can, we go help put it out. So it's a nice way to get experience working with them as well, and they learn from us and we learn from them, and it's good cross-pollination.
What's been the primary source of many of the wildfires that are local here?
Local, it's all human caused.
Or human caused?
Yeah. Out west you get a lot of lightning caused fires and human, but here it's
Human.
Lightning doesn't really cause fires here.
Okay.
Occasionally you might get a tree that's struck that will catch on fire, but it doesn't spread like it does out west. Yes? Is it Brandon?
No, Jacob.
Jacob, I'm sorry.
Since you're talking about training, do they train you to use special tools, and what tools do you use?
Good question. Yes, they do train us to use special tools. Hand tools like shovels and Pulaskis and rakes and things like that, which are really pretty simple to get the hang of. A Pulaski it's got two heads. One side is an axe and the other side is like a hoe.
Oh, okay.
And so we can dig line with that hoe, or we can spin it around, and we can cut branches off of trees or cut trees down with that axe.
Do you use fire extinguishers or water?
Water and foam. And so here, I'll back up here. You see that's an engine on the right hand side there. That's called a Type 6 wildland fire engine. It's carrying 300 gallons of water and some foam, and it carries hand tools and hose, and there's a leaf blower on it. It carries an awful lot of tools, but that's a piece of equipment that we're trained on, and we use that to squirt water or to just deliver us to the fire, and then we hike in and use our hand tools if we can't get the engine to it. And then on the left hand side there is a Polaris Ranger that is basically a mini firefighting engine. It has 75 gallons of water on it, and a pump and a hose reel, and it's got some hand tools and a chainsaw and those kinds of things.
So does Pottawattamie County Conservation own that?
Yes.
Cool.
That's all part of our program. Yes.
What's the most important tool you use to put out a fire?
Yeah.
Right there. Your brain. Absolutely. There's no question about it. That's a really good question.
So how do you learn to make those decisions that are so important? Is that the training?
Training and experience. We often talk about something called recognition primed decision making. So you're making decisions based on your training, but also you're primed through recognition by the experiences that you've had before.
Okay.
Experiences in training and experiences in the real world. We learn from our mistakes and we learn from our successes, and everything combined.
Do any volunteer fire departments have any prairie wildfire fighting equipment? Or?
Most volunteer departments have what they call a brush truck, which is very similar to a wildland fire engine. They might not be equipped the same way that this is, but pretty similar.
Okay.
And this is the kind of stuff that we've been talking about, and just a few more images of the equipment that we're using and some of the firefighters working. The image on the right, you can start to see one of the better tools that we utilize. You see the ATV, you see that Polaris Ranger there, but then the firefighter behind the Ranger is kind of stooped over, and he's holding a drip torch. A drip torch is an ignition device. It's basically a pot. It's a chamber that about this big around, stands about this tall, and it has a wick that comes out of it. And then that chamber, it's filled with a mixture of gasoline and diesel fuel. And when you tip it upside down, the fuel spills out through the wick and ignites, and then it lands on the ground and it lights the vegetation. And it turns out that many times when we're fighting a fire, we get out to the side of it and sometimes in front of it, and we light a fire that will burn into it. And then that will put it out, as long as we can hold the line where we lit the fire.
Okay.
So we might
Can you
light
write
along.
that one down?
We might light along
What's
the
it
edge
called?
of the
It's
road.
called
It's a burnout
okay.
operation. We might light a backfire, or we might light a flame
Drip
fire.
torch, that.
Oh,
Drip
drip torch. Very good.
Okay, drip
Yep.
torch, and you can burn back towards it.
Yep.
Excellent.
And this, you can see two firefighters here that are using those drip torches, and they're lighting off of the line that has been mowed in the tall grass. All the grass is laying down here because of the snow, but they're lighting off of a line that was mowed through that, and then those Rangers are laying down a wet line. They're spraying water on the ground, on the vegetation, and then we light right off of that, and then that water keeps the fire from moving the other side. And then the firefighters coming behind that make sure it doesn't cross that water, because it can dry the water out and creep across. And then this is just a chart that shows how we are building our capacity, and we're starting to burn more in Pottawattamie County. In 1999, we burned not a whole lot of acres there. That's not going to tell me. It's not going to tell me. But you can see how every year we're burning more and more acres. And we burn in the spring and the fall. We used to burn a little bit in the summer. You see 2003 and 2004, there's a few acres burned in the summer. But most of our fire now is happening in the fall, because that's when the Native Americans were burning. And it's just a much healthier fire. We still do some fire in the spring. You see last spring we burned just under 400 acres. And in the fall we burned a little over 1,000 acres.
Wow.
Yes.
Big difference.
Why is 2002 so low?
2002?
2000.
2000? If I remember right, I think there was a burn ban that year. And it was really dry conditions. Mm-hmm. And the county had a burn ban and said nobody can burn. Oh. And so we didn't burn that year in the fall.
Except just a tiny bit.
Tiny bit in the spring. Yep. And also, that's when we were beginning to burn. 1999 and 2000, we were just beginning to do fire management, and
It looks like there wasn't a whole lot of planning for burning at that point.
that's right. We didn't have a lot of equipment, and we just didn't have a lot of ability to do this. We didn't have very many people that were trained, so we just burned a little bit, and then over time we just keep kind of increasing what we're doing. So, and this just shows the Luss Hills, that kind of gray color all up and down Iowa, or the western side of Iowa. You can see Harrison County, which is where we're at right now, right in the middle there. And then the red areas are what are called the special landscape areas. The National Park Service took a look at the Luss Hills and identified the best areas in the Luss Hills, and those are the areas in red. And those are the areas that we kind of try to focus our conservation efforts on, because they have the best pieces of prairie and the best woodlands still. And so we're working hard to try to save those, and that's where we're trying to put our fire and make those areas healthier. Yes?
What's the spot that firefighters and stuff, that they mostly focus on to prevent a wildfire?
There are different strategies to prevent wildfires. One is education, and just teaching people about how to be careful with fire, and also teaching people how to live in an area that is prone to fire, especially if you think about out west in the mountains. Those are areas that are going to burn, and they're very difficult to control those fires. And so there are things that homeowners can do to kind of protect their resources from those fires. So education is an important part of preventing fire, but also using fire, burning, putting fire on the land. It's been demonstrated that when there is a wildfire and it's burning in an area that hasn't burned for decades, it burns very intensely and is very difficult for firefighters to control. But when that fire reaches an area that has recently burned, within the last few years or so, the fire just lays down. The intensity really drops, and it's much easier to control. And so where fire is being utilized on the landscape, it's a much healthier condition, and it's not, you don't get these catastrophic wildfires. You don't get these high intensity, high severity fires. You get low intensity, low severity fires that are much healthier. And so prevention is education. It's also having the firefighting resources to deal with the fires, but it's also utilizing fire, having good, healthy fire out on the landscape.
So education, and write down utilizing fire to control, so that we have more recent burns, so it isn't possible for that historic burn.
Yeah.
Wow, that's cool.
Yeah. And when we say good fire, we mean fire that is consistent with the historic fire return interval and consistent with the historic fire conditions, much like the Native Americans were doing.
Madison, you have a question?
That was for that one graph.
Oh, okay.
In a little bit, about 10 minutes.
Okay. All right. So I'll tape when you need to leave. Okay? All right.
That's all I have for slides.
Okay. What questions do you guys have now? Okay, so having the right equipment, and we wrote down some of that, having that equipment available and ready, having well-trained firefighters so that they can manage it before it gets out of control. Okay, and then having right equipment. Now, when you get up in the mountains and stuff, is there, are they making great inroads and doing the prescribed burns and the,
No.
Just too many acres?
Out west, there's very localized success happening in some areas with a little bit with prescribed fire, but more commonly with mechanical treatment, where they'll go in and they'll log an area. And today it's not logging like we think of taking out big trees. They're actually doing the opposite. They're taking out many of the small trees, leaving the big trees, and getting it closer to a condition like it was historically. And those mechanical treatments are necessary. But it turns out that
I still got a few minutes. You're okay.
probably the most important thing is for the general public to understand the role of fire and be tolerant of it. And there's no tolerance. So people look at Yellowstone, which burned in 1988, huge fires in Yellowstone in 1988. And that really opened people's eyes to the fact that fire is part of this system, and it's necessary. And many people are, through surveys and things like that, are showing that people are becoming more understanding of that, but not in my backyard. So we understand that Yellowstone should burn, but we don't want it in my backyard, because then we have to breathe smoke, and we have to look at a blackened landscape for a month or so. And so there's no tolerance. And so while we know as fire managers, we know that we should be lighting fires and doing prescribed fires, it's not happening out west because there's just no tolerance for it.
Get any pushback from the Les Hills?
We have found it much easier here in the Midwest. Probably because we're working on a smaller scale. Probably because most of our landscape is agricultural. And so there's not a lot of wildlands to burn. But where I'm at Hitchcock, it's a 1,200 acre preserve that we started burning in 1998. And initially, the old timers said, they all said, oh yeah, of course, I remember when my grandpa was burning these hills. Or, these hills used to burn all the time. I can remember that as a kid. And these hills need it. And then the young people, especially the people who had moved out of the city, were like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? This is awful. And so the old timers understood, and newcomers weren't very tolerant, but very quickly they saw that we were capable of doing this. and they saw the results, and so they're on board.
Okay.
And it happened really quickly.
Okay.
It's not happened that way out west.
That'd be about right for me. So, how many acres do you burn in Pot County now?
We're burning about 1,000 in the fall and 300, 400, maybe 500 in the spring.
Okay. And does Harrison County have a similar plan, or?
Harrison County Conservation burns. They don't burn as much as we do.
Okay.
They're beginning to burn more. Most of the fire that they do is in the spring, but they're beginning to do a little bit in the fall also.
Okay. Because we see a lot of yours is in the fall.
Yes. Yeah, that's not typical.
Oh, okay.
Most organizations in Iowa are burning in the spring.
When it's more wet, or?
I think that's actually kind of an artifact of the Euro-American and agricultural mentality.
Okay.
I mean, the evidence shows that most fires were happening in the fall historically. But for some reason, science and culture, our culture, has pushed all of this to the spring.
Okay.
And when I started burning, I was burning in the spring because everybody else was. And I think that's the way a lot of people are. But as I learned more and more about it, and also saw the results, that has pushed me towards fall fire. And other people are starting to do that too.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Here in Iowa, sometimes winter doesn't ever get snow. Do you guys ever burn when that happens?
In the winter? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we will burn anytime in the dormant season. So as soon as everything goes dormant in the fall, after the first killing frost, things start going dormant. And it's likely that we're going to get that first killing frost tonight. Or maybe tomorrow night.
Be ready.
Yeah.
Cover your plants if you want it to last.
Not today. It's like
We did have some frost this morning. Yeah.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh.
My dad couldn't see it.
Yeah. And so things start shutting down after that frost, and that's when we'll start burning. And we can burn any time until things start to green up in the winter or in the spring. So that whole dormant season is when we're looking to burn. Usually we get most of it done in the fall, before the snows come and start to compress the leaf litter and smash down the grasses. We like to burn when everything's fluffy and standing up. Good question.
Well, obviously you've been burning for several years. Are you reburning areas?
Oh yeah. I mean, we're now burning everything every year.
Oh.
Much more like the Native Americans were doing.
Okay.
What we found is there's a lot of concern because only 1/10% of Iowa is natural anymore.
Right.
There's a lot of concern that if you burn everything, then you're killing all the bugs, and there's no overwintering habitat and things like that. And so what we used to do was we'd say, okay, we're going to burn this area this year in the spring, and then next year we'll burn this in the fall, and then a couple of years later we'll burn this spring and this fall, and we'll kind of move this around, and we'll have all of these unburned areas in time and create this really heterogeneous, diverse mosaic. And that's kind of the widely accepted approach right now.
Okay.
That's how we were doing it. But it dawned on me that, why do it that way? Well, the reason for doing it that way is because we don't want to kill all the bugs and things like that. And there's, especially from the butterfly folks, there's really strong opposition to the use of fire.
Oh.
We started burning everything every year because what we realized was when you leave that patchiness like that, it's meaningful to an egotistical human being looking at a computer screen, looking at an aerial photo. It means absolutely nothing to an ant or to a caterpillar or something small that could care less if you burned 40 acres over there and left 15 acres here. Because if they lived in that 40 acres, they're not going to make it to that 15 acres.
Okay.
So what we do now is we burn everything every year so that we burn only 1 year's accumulation of fuel. It's all standing, it's all light, and it burns through there, but it burns very lightly. And it skips around and leaves a lot of areas unburned. And those areas might be the size of these tables, or they might be the size of this room, or they might be the size of this whole block. And some areas partially burn, some areas fully burn, some areas don't burn at all. And it's leaving that random pattern all over the landscape at a scale that's much more meaningful to those critters that live there. Maybe not so meaningful to me looking at the computer screen, but much more meaningful
So
to them.
yes, the next question is, what's the next question? How does burning affect
The environment.
wildlife, critters, insects, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, certainly there can be direct mortality. If a snake happens to not make its way into its burrow and is in the path of the fire, it can be killed. Same thing with a mouse or a bird or something like that. What we've found is that the plant community is adapted to fire. It responds by having more vigorous growth, and we found that the animal community is just the same. They are adapted to this. I mean, their ancestors were living on the prairie when the prairie was burning historically. It's programmed into them. In fact, I think about years ago, one of the first fires we were doing in the woods, we were only burning 20 acres. And we lit a ring fire, which means we lit a huge circle of fire, and it was all burning into the middle. And I happened to walk in there, and it was burning in the leaf litter, in the timber. And so the fire was only flame lengths about this tall. I can easily step across that and be very safe. I can step from the unburned fuel right across the fire into the black and be very safe. And so I was walking in there, and I heard a lot of rustling in the leaves, and I looked, and there were about 7 deer that were in the middle of this, in the area that had not been burned, a ring of fire all the way around them. And they'd all run over this way, and they'd see that fire, and then they'd turn, and they'd all run over here, and there was fire. Everywhere they turned, there was fire, and it was like they were panicked. And then all of a sudden, it's like they all just kind of took a deep breath. And this was the first time that these deer had seen fire, because it was the first time we burned at Hitchcock Nature Center. Hadn't burned there in decades, and so older than these deer. They had never seen fire. But all of a sudden, they just kind of, it's like they took a deep breath, and something kicked in the recesses of their brain, and they all just kind of trotted and stepped right across that fire into the black and went on their way. Like all of a sudden, that instinct just kicked in. And that's when it struck me that these critters, they'll figure it out. They know what's going on. It is programmed into them, just like it's programmed into the grasses and the wildflowers. And they deal with that fire much better than humans do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
If animals have like the instinct to get out, do fires still help with extinction populations with animals? Like if there's a wildfire and so many animals get killed and stuff because they didn't make it out, would that be helping with the extinction population, or do most animals actually get out of the wildfire?
Most of them get out. There is some direct mortality, but it's a pretty low percentage. But again, you have to keep in mind that there's different kinds of fire. So if you're thinking about out west, if there's an area that hasn't been burned for many, many decades, and you get a wildfire in there, it can burn incredibly hot because there's such a buildup of fuel. Whereas if you have an area that has burned recently, and it's in a more healthy condition, you don't have as much fuel accumulated, it doesn't burn as hot. And so in those areas where it burns really, really hot, it can be devastating. It can scorch the soil and sterilize the soil. It can kill too many trees, and all of those things can lead to more indirect mortality with the wildlife. Because if the plants can't respond well, then the animals certainly can't, because the plants support all of the animals. But if you have fire that's more healthy, it's a better fire, and it's in a healthier system, it actually stimulates the system to be healthier, and that benefits the animals. Yes?
We read about all these animals that were endangered. What if, like, a fire had cornered a bunch of these endangered animals? What do you think all those animals would do? And it's, like, really tall. Because there's a bunch that really can't defend themselves.
Do you have a specific example? What kind you're thinking about?
Well, there's frogs. Well, I'm kind of thinking about, like, this little frog. It is very, 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 very rare to see. There's only, like,
Purple pig nose thing?
yeah, that one.
It's in
pig-nosed
India.
frog?
It's in India.
Yeah.
It's in India.
Oh, so probably not great to run into wildfires in
Really, really
America.
ugly.
Yeah. Well, in all those cases, you know, it really depends on the kind of fire, and it depends on that specific organism, that kind of animal, and how they interact with their environment. You know, if a fire happens at a time of year when an animal needs a specific plant, that can be really harmful to that animal and to that population.
Oh, it's like, yeah, burning up his
Yeah,
stash
it's
of
like-
Doritos.
Exactly. It's like if our grocery store burned down and we had no other place to get food, we'd kind of be in a pickle. And they're the same way. And we have, it's one of the arguments against burning in our area during the growing season.
Oh, okay.
You know, historically there would have been fires during the growing season, but you saw that map. All of Iowa was natural.
Lots of grasslands.
Yes. And so there was refugia all over the place. Then you saw the next map. There's very little left in Iowa that's natural. In fact, this is the most altered state in the country. It's the least natural state. Not a ranking that we're particularly proud of. So we have to be very sensitive to the fact that there are some critters that have very specialized needs, and you know, if we burn through everything and just totally wipe the slate clean, that's trouble.
Okay.
What we found with our annual fire regime is it skips around, and so it doesn't wipe the slate clean. It leaves that heterogeneity.
Okay. Out west, when you are fighting, do you see a lot of wildlife out there when you're fighting?
Yeah. It depends on the area where we're at.
Do they have to ever go in and rescue, or, I mean, to block off an area to allow deer to escape? Or that kind of a thing, or?
No, I mean, really the approach that we take out there is try to get this fire contained.
Okay.
Whatever's within there, you know, it's kind of on its own. We don't put firefighters in a position to save wildlife and put themselves at risk.
Okay.
You know, the first priority for us is safety. Safety of the firefighters, the safety of the people that we're trying to protect, and their homes and things like that.
Is it possible to do prescribed burns enough around where there are communities to create at least, other than a devastating fire, where fire wouldn't be able to reach the urban area?
Yeah, there are communities, especially in the Southwest, that are using mechanical thinning and then following up with prescribed fire in the outreaches of the community to try to reduce the fuel load right there. Because beyond them is national forest land and other wilderness lands that have high fuel loads. And what they're concerned about is if a fire starts there and wind is blowing towards our community,
There's nothing to stop it.
how are we going to stop it?
Yeah.
But if they create a buffer around them where their natural areas there are healthy and there's a reduced fuel load, when that fire does hit that buffer, it drops down in intensity and it provides an opportunity for us firefighters to get
Oh,
and
so
work.
then, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Do you work with landowners in the Les Hills to do stuff that would prevent, grab chairs, guys, there's down there. To prevent, someone lives up in the Les Hills and they come to you and say, I know you're doing prescribed burns and stuff, what else can we do to minimize fire in our warehouses?
Well, one thing we're doing is teaching these landowner fire ecology workshops so that we teach people about the role of fire in the community, and then we also teach them how to use fire. That's easily translated to how to defend against fire.
Okay.
Because the tactics that we use to contain a prescribed fire are the same tactics that we use to put out a wildfire.
Okay.
So very easily transferable. And then the other thing is there's a program, a national program called FireWise. I don't know if you've...
FireWise, somebody write that down. We'll have to look that up. FireWise.
If you just Google FireWise, that has all kinds of information for homeowners to create defensible space around their home and their buildings. And it talks about removing flammable vegetation. It talks about how to do the landscaping in your yard and things like that to protect from fire. It's focused on the western fire environment, out in the mountains and out west. But the principles apply here as well.
Okay. The I don't know if you remember. I don't know what year it was. The wildfire that went through Up by Carson?
Yeah. 2005, I believe.
Okay, did you get called in on that at all?
We did, very late.
Okay.
It started about 11 o'clock in the morning. We didn't get a call until about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And by the time we got resources together and made it over there, it was about 5 o'clock.
How could that be prevented how could that have been, you've been the first line of defense, I would think, because you have the expertise in fighting that kind of a fire, or was it just the intensity and wind, or?
Well, certainly it was kind of all the holes in the Swiss cheese lined up.
Okay.
I mean, it was extremely dry conditions that were leading up to that. The topsoil was really dry. It hadn't been moisture for quite a long time, so all the fuels were dry. And then on that particular day, it was warm, very windy. It was in March, and so it was before anything was greening up. And so it was just ripe for a fire. There's nothing we can do about that. I think the important lesson that needs to come out of that fire, and I think some of that lesson has been learned, is one, training is so important. I mean, really, the first line of defense is the volunteer fire departments. And most of the training that they get, if not all of the training, is related to structure of fire and EMS, rescue.
Right.
Very little wildland fire training. And wildland fire is different than structural fire. And many times we see fire departments overwhelmed by a fire moving across the landscape because they're accustomed to a stationary fire in a structure. And so it's a different animal to manage. And I saw some things that were happening that day that indicated that the command structure and everything was just overwhelmed. The other thing is that command structure itself is important for people to be able to work in. And when you go out west and work on a wildfire, it's just a very different system than we see here on wildfires. It's a command structure that's well rehearsed, well practiced, and all of the firefighters integrate very well. They know their role and they perform their role. And we don't see the same discipline, the same, the same ability to function in that system here, especially when something's running and gunning like that. And then the tactics. The tactics, again, like I said, mostly structural oriented, and the wildland tactics are so different, and we have to be well rehearsed in that.
Okay. Kelsey.
What trees burn the best? Like dead trees or live trees?
Dead trees certainly burn better. Juniper trees, or many people around here call them cedar trees, they can burn really hot. The deciduous trees don't burn as well.
What about like live trees? What live trees are
The juniper trees, when they're live, they can burn, especially coming out of the winter into the early spring, because their fuel moisture is very low. Even though they're alive, they're pretty dry. But as soon as you start getting spring rains, in fact, you can see it if you watch the cedar trees in the spring. They'll have kind of a brown color to them. They're still alive, but they kind of look brown. And then as soon as you start getting some warm rains, they green up, and they have a lot more fuel moisture then, and they don't burn as well.
Okay, so for you guys that have just recently arrived, what questions, we've listened and learned lots, what questions do you still have about wildfires that Chad could answer, because he's an expert in working with the wildfires? Jacob, you can ask another one.
So, you know how cedar trees, they kind of, I don't know how to say this, attack other trees and make them grow better. How would that affect a wildfire?
That's a really good question. What we have found is that the cedar trees tend to crowd out the other vegetation. And so if you look under a dense stand of cedar trees, there's very little growing underneath them. And the fuel that's really carrying the fire and allowing it to spread across the landscape in this part of the country is the leaf litter and the grass. And where those cedar trees are and there's nothing growing under them, that means there's no fuel. So oftentimes the fire will get to that area of dense cedar trees and just go out because there's no fuel. But if there's something to carry that fire with enough intensity and enough heat, into the cedar trees, then they can burn really hot.
Okay.
Oftentimes, though, after the first few trees burn, it just dies down. It doesn't sustain itself, doesn't continue to go through the trees, unless there's a really strong wind behind it and their fuel moisture is low. So, the fire environment is very dependent on the conditions. It's dependent on the weather conditions of that day. It's dependent on the amount of moisture that's in the system from the previous weeks and months. And it's dependent on the condition of the fuel on that at that particular moment, and how it's structured, how it's laid out, and how dry it is.
Do you have any of your training like online, like electronic, that a person can?
Yeah.
Okay.
We do the S130, S190 is online.
Oh, okay. But like with your landowners and stuff, do you have any like recorded sessions that people can go and watch?
I don't think so.
They pretty much have to come face to face? Okay. Okay.
You remember when I said earlier that I'm not very good at technology?
Well, but I was thinking this is a very technology-laden group.
Oh, yeah.
And I thought they might have some suggestions on how to make that so that people can sit in their slippers and watch and learn and figure out on their own time,
right.
Even to make more of an impact, because your message is really makes a big impact. But
they could figure it out.
Yeah.
I have found that these minds at this table are a lot smarter than this mind, especially when it comes to technology.
Okay, other questions? Allie, Misty, Ramey, you guys came in late. But I know that you've been thinking about wildfires, because we spent a lot of time focusing on, and last week on Monday we went through, there really, as we talked about, 3 different phases. One is preparing and preventing, which you shared quite a bit on preventing tonight. The next is how to survive that, which you guys found some cool things, and much of what you dealt with was smoke, like trying to evacuate and getting in areas. Who was it? Was it somebody?
Surviving is Calcimi and Ramey.
Yeah, and you guys came up with some really good stuff.
If you're in a car, you have to shut all the air vents and make sure all the doors are closed.
And the windows are up.
Yeah.
Yeah, so surviving or be able to evacuate. And then the third one is rebuilding, or again, I just think it's such a great thing that if it burns on a regular basis, then you don't have that intensity of the fuel, you don't have the intensity of the fire kind of a thing.
Yeah, and one of the things, especially out west, is that, and really truly right here too, is that when you have a catastrophic fire, a wildfire that burns through an area where there's an unnatural accumulation of fuel, you do damage to the soils, and it's already, that whole plant community is already in a degraded condition, and it affects your hydrology. And so oftentimes when you listen to the news and you hear about a fire out west, they're concerned about the watershed. They're concerned about a fire burning in an area that is draining water to a lake or to a river or something that is providing drinking water for a community. Or when you have good, healthy fire in that watershed and you're stimulating those plants, you have healthier root systems which hold the soil better and promote infiltration of the water. When it rains, the water goes into the ground and gets cleansed and slowly drains to the rivers and the lakes. But when you have an unhealthy system and the root systems aren't healthy, the water is washing across the land and carrying sediment into the rivers and the lakes. And then when you get a wildfire, it carries soil and other sediment, and it carries a lot more of it, and so it pollutes that source of drinking water. And it's not unlike what's going on here in the Midwest. Our natural areas are really good at building soil, holding water, and then slowly releasing that water to the streams as cool, clear water. But as our natural areas have degraded over time, and as we've replaced them with corn and beans, the water runs across the land instead of into the land.
And it builds up the silt.
It builds up the silt, but it also promotes catastrophic flooding on a more frequent scale. So our rivers rise faster and fall faster, much more violent flooding. And we have a tendency to blame the rain and say, oh, it rained too much. But it's not that it's raining too much, it's that we've changed the landscape and it can't deal with the water like it's supposed to.
Okay.
do you mean?
Can fires happen like just from heat, from being really hot outside? No.
It needs some kind of ignition, a spark. And when it gets really hot outside and somebody's mowing grass and they hit rock with the blade and it sparks, that could potentially cause ignition, but you need that spark. You need that ignition source to get the fire going. You can't just spontaneously combust. Yes.
What's the best wildfire region here?
What do you mean by the best?
Like where where wildfires happen most often?
Florida.
Really? I was in California.
Yeah. Florida has the highest frequency of lightning strikes in the country and extremely flammable vegetation. And Florida can burn at any time of the year. That's why we go to Florida to train.
Oh.
Because we like to go to Florida in the winter.
That's a good choice anyway. How prevalent is water sources when you're fighting fires out in the...
Out in the mountains?
Yeah.
We were fighting a fire this summer in Montana, and there was just a trickle coming down the mountainside, and so we made a dam to back up some water so that we could have some water to work with. Oftentimes there's no water at all. And so sometimes we'll be working with a helicopter that is... It has a bucket suspended from a cable underneath the helicopter, and it will dip out of a lake or a stream, and it will fly over the fire, and then we direct it from the ground, and we say, okay, we need you to drop water on this part of the fire or whatever. And so sometimes we use water that way. Sometimes we just put water in a 5-gallon backpack and we hike it up the hill. Other times we'll use pumps to pump water through hoses up the hill, or we use engines to drive the water there. And many times there's no water at all, and so we just dig line and put dirt on it and mix the fire into the soil and put it out that way.
Oh.
Yes.
But if you did have water, what's your favorite way of transporting water?
With an engine. Yep. Yes.
Like sometimes like the helicopters come around, they drop all the chemicals. Do they usually do that when there's water, or like when the firefighters have water or no water? Or,
Usually when we need water, that's when we're using the helicopters. If we can get water to it without the helicopters, that's a little bit more effective. It's better to squirt the water from a hose because you can be a lot more accurate than dropping it from the sky.
Yeah,
and it's cheaper.
Did you guys see a picture or something where they're dropping some kind of chemical and it got on the firefighters?
It was like
The retardant?
Yeah.
Is it red?
Yeah.
It's called retardant.
Does that bother the firefighters a lot, or no?
It just turns us red.
Shower when you get done, I guess.
Yeah, we got slurried, or sometimes we'll say we got painted. Yes.
What's the worst place to be during the
In it. No, when we're doing our training, we oftentimes we look for topographic features like a box canyon, which is kind of a dead-end canyon, because wind tends to funnel there, and the fire can be much more intense moving up through that, or narrow canyons, saddles where you've got a ridge line, but there's a dip in the ridge line. That fire and the wind can kind of funnel right through there. So those are really bad places to be. And areas where there's really heavy accumulation of fuel. Those are another area that we want to try to avoid. It's a good question.
Okay, any other questions? We've done a lot to exhaust you tonight, but this is great information.
Work snack?
Work
snack? Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Snack.
Yes, we need to have snack. But first, let's do one thing, though.